Hello people, we're coming today with a microphone. That's an upgrade, so hopefully you appreciate it. And today I wanted to talk to you about how I lost £3,000 earlier this year, and I don't actually regret it. It was a conscious loss of this money, and I did that in the context of a purchasing of buy-to-let property that I thought I wanted to buy, but then ended up stepping back from and not continuing to buy. So if you're interested, please continue watching. My rationale for even wanting to start, looking into buy-to-let properties, what drove me to that kind of investment, and then eventually what happened and why I chose to step back from, the investment and actually decide to lose that £3,000. Sometimes we choose not to walk away from investments because of sunken cost fallacy. So basically, the thought that I've already spent, £3,000, I'm in too deep right now, so I'm just going to go ahead with the investment. And to me, this is a very scary bias that we have, and so I try to be very conscious. And this year has actually been a big year for me to learn that money in itself is not everything, and sometimes losing a little bit of money to not feel trapped and not find yourself in a situation that you're going to regret later down the line is actually a good way to spend your money, counterintuitively. Yeah, let me tell you a little bit more about what happened and why I don't regret, going forward with my decisions. Back in December 2024, I found out that I got a raise at my job, which was, very good news. I'd worked towards it very, very hard, and I'm happy to do a separate video on this because it was a 35% raise. So I'm more than happy to talk about that if you're interested. But based on this setup, I thought, I already have a property in Italy that I rent out. It's a buy-to-let, even though we don't call it that, but it's basically an Airbnb that I rent out on those platforms on a short-term let basis. So I'm familiar with it already. Why not look into the UK property market as well to try and see if I can do something like this? Of course, I live in London, for those of you who don't know, but and the property prices in London, as you will imagine, as is everything, is extremely prohibitive when it comes to everyday investors. If you're not like a millionaire, come from a very wealthy family yourself. So immediately I thought London is out of the question for me. I don't want to put too much cash in it. And that was kind of like my parameter. So I had a few parameters in mind. I wanted to put down as little cash as I could because I didn't want to tie down too much of my money. I wanted to use that money for other investments. And I wanted to do it through a limited company, right? Because of tax advantages. And again, I'm more than happy to go into how that works in another video if that's something that you're interested. This was kind of like what I was thinking, and I started looking into different properties. I was trying to, of course, I'm not an expert, so I was trying to understand where in the UK or in England rather would be best for me to invest. So where there's trying to marry a few factors, being demand, regeneration, where are some areas that are up and coming, but still not too saturated or not too mainstream, let's say, where property prices have already risen massively. And of course, people will always tell you like South is best for property investment, but of course the prices there are very, very high. Of course, places like Cambridge, Oxford, fantastic, but again, they cost a lot still, so it wasn't really that much more advantageous than trying to buy in London. I was then exploring Manchester for a little bit. I lived in Manchester, so I was more familiar with it than any other area apart from London in the UK. So that was a natural one. But still, when I looked into properties, and again, another metric for me, another parameter for me was it had to be a new build property. I didn't want to deal with an older property that might have some maintenance issues and might have to have much more work done to it, basically. So yeah, that was my kind of like another parameter. So in Manchester, though, when I was looking at new builds, again, prices still very, very high. Like we're talking £300,000. I wish £300,000 for a 2-bed. I decided to look into Yorkshire and the Humber as an area because this is where, if you look into some of the studies as well and some of the market reports, it seems like it's still a little bit of an undervalued, underdeveloped area. the ROI basically for these properties is still very, very high, because basically still like an up and coming area, and it's more risky, of course, as we always know, higher risk, higher rewards, right? So I knew that starting to look into that, it was a bit of a gamble on my part, but also it was much more advantageous. I have the spreadsheets in front of me. The cost of the unit that I was looking into, which was a one bed, was £118,000, which is, yeah, considerably less than anything else that I'd seen so far. And I was supposed to put down 25% of the property at exchange, which would have been £27,000 plus a reservation fee, which we start now to get into the costs, right? The initial costs. So, I spoke with the agents. I got a good feeling. I, continued doing all my forecasts. Was forecasted to receive, let's say, on average, after all taxes and expenses and bills, council tax and service charge and whatnot, around £400 to £500 clean every month. Again, net income after every expense. And of course, first year was supposed to be a bit more difficult as the property kind of like starts getting into the market and gets more positive feedback from people and from tourists, starting to use it, or likely contract workers. That would have been one of the key demographics for this particular property. And then, it was set to increase. And I mean, the forecasting sheets, like, we'll never know, of course, like the further into the future you look, the least the less reliable it becomes, basically. But the forecast was that by the 10th year of me holding the property, I could have expected a monthly income of almost £1,000, give or take. So, very good. But then the other factor that I haven't talked about yet, about why I was looking into property and why I do enjoy property and why I like it as an investment vehicle, is that, of course, whilst you get the kind of like the rental income if you do decide to rent out the property, which for me that would have been, it's the only, at the moment I'm not considering buying a property for myself to live in. It's not the stage of life that I'm in right now, so I'm not even thinking about that. So for a rental property, of course you have the revenue, the rental of the monies that you collect every month from it, but then on top of that you also have the uplift in the equity, right? The expectation being that your property is going to increase in value the more you hold it, hopefully. I mean, of course, you never know when there's a market fall. We all remember 2008, all those things. But theoretically, over a long period of time, your property price will go up, will increase. And so you have a double factor, right? So you have your rental income and then you have the uplift in equity that you're supposed to be getting. And one strategy that serial property investors use is what is called a remortgaging strategy, which means you're actually not selling your property, but you're freeing up liquidity or cash or money, basically, once you go to renegotiate your mortgage. So finding a new mortgage in, let's say, in 5 years' time. And so you're freeing up the difference of the capital increase and the equity increase that would have happened in those 5 years' time, right? People continue doing that continuously, basically. So this is everything that sounded good, let's say. What happened, right? And also, as a little side note, so this mechanism that I kind of described, and the fact of putting down as little cash of your own as you can and then using leverage or a mortgage basically to fund the rest of your investment, is effectively what private equity clients do. When you hear about leverage buyouts, this is effectively what they're talking about, is basically the concept of using the bank's money, in this case, to fund your own investment. And so you decrease the risk of your own cash, and most importantly, you don't tie down your cash into one asset only, and you have the freedom to do with it whatever you want. So for example, investing it in the stock market, or investing it in a company, stakes in a company, I don't know, whatever you want to do, or keeping it on you. But the key thing here is that mortgages, when it comes to private investors, people that don't have access to investment through private equity, they are still the cheapest way of getting loans, basically. And so, I do recognize this. Now, as a side note, of course, had I gone through the limited company route, the interest rates on these mortgages are higher than a private loan that you would get, if you bought in your own personal capacity. So, it changes. Like, it's not completely true in the sense that they are the cheapest way if you do it through a limited company, but still the same principle applies, like the principle of leveraging someone else's money to create more wealth for yourself, basically. So that was very appealing to me. So we go back to what happened. Why did I walk away in the end, and why did I not go through with it? And most crucially, why do I not regret it, right? Because, it all sounds great. It all sounds like, a great investment opportunity that I should have taken. And to understand this, there are a few factors. And I think that ultimately what it boiled down to was an understanding of my life priorities and the better understanding of the area specifically that I was looking to buy, which is such a key thing to consider when you're wanting to buy such a solid thing as a property, right? And perhaps, call me naive, is not something that, I mean, of course I knew it's important, but like I potentially underestimated when I first started, considering this investment, and I potentially rushed a little bit into it. So, once I put down the £2,500 for, to hold the property, I then paid some legal fee searches, which you have to pay basically to start the process, and then there were some accountant fees as well to like set up the limited company and do some other due diligence and set up a bank account and all these things. And of course, once you do that through an agency, like they always try and upsell you like a lot of these things. But anyway, so the total of my costs arrived at like roughly £3,100 basically that I put down. So the first thing is I realized that like as solid as a forecast that I thought I had, basically you never know, it's still a risk. You're taking on a big financial burden, which is basically loaning a bank or owing a bank £100,000 basically, which in my case I already have another mortgage, so I'm already pretty heavily leveraged. So going there and adding another six-figure loan to my leverage position already is a risk, right? But of course, high risk, high rewards. So that's part of the deal, basically. And you have to take some risks, if you want to make, financial strides. Another thing, going back to my life priorities, is having this burden, whether or not, you're not, I wasn't even planning on living in the property itself, but it's still something that would have tied me to, this country, and specifically that region, Yorkshire, which I hadn't even been to yet, for a very, very long time. So whether I liked it or not. And it comes with a lot of admin. So even if, I was planning on enlisting an agency, of course, to rent it out as I'm doing for my flat in Florence. It's a lot of work still, even as you try and outsource as much as you can, there's still headaches, there are still bills that you would have to pay as the landlord, there are still people that are not going to pay on time, and people times of vacancies, right, where you're not going to be able to fill your property. And so it is headaches still, and I've seen that already with my property in Florence, which I can make a separate video on that investment because I have a lot of thoughts now, almost a year and a half into it being on the market. Let me know if you would like it. And ultimately, so we go back to the factor of area. What really made the deal, or like broke the deal for me in this case, was I went up to Yorkshire, to Hull, roughly 2 weeks before the completion, the exchange date, basically. So that's the point in which you can't back out, basically, because up until the point I put down my reservation fee, the 2,500, which they only serve for the purpose of taking the property off market, so no one else can buy it instead of you, basically. But you can still back out from the deal if you don't want to, basically, which is lucky for me in this case. But yeah, so we were approaching completion or exchange date, and so I decided to, finally go up there and see it with my own eyes, basically. And luckily, I found out that a friend of mine's parents lived there, and he himself, this friend of mine, very good friend of mine, was born there, lived there. He lives in San Francisco currently, so that's why we hadn't really talked about that until February, which is when I went up in Hull. But yeah, so once we realized, he was like, hey, look, my dad, he actually worked at the city council for 20 years, so he can show you around. So I went there, and they were amazing, both his parents. I spent the whole day with them. I did a tour of the the city center, and with the dad, and went up to actually see the property, which is still under construction because it's a new development. And so he showed me around, and seeing that with my own eyes gave me a whole other understanding of the area. And the one thing that you need to know, of course, about agencies that have a stake into selling these houses is, because they have a stake, they have an interest in wanting to sell that to you, they're always going to, portray these areas and properties as better than they are, and that's part of the deal, because it's ultimately, the brochures that they share with you, they're marketing materials. They're supposed to be selling you something, and so I'm not blaming them. It's just part of the deal, and you have to understand that as a potential buyer, right? So yeah, you basically always have to slash, like, I don't know, a 50% of the nice things that they say from those brochures, both in terms of the pictures and also in terms of the potential of the area. Because one thing that they were saying is, oh, this area is so up and coming, and there's so much regeneration and investment going into it, and all these things. And then I spoke with people in the area, and I've lived there, that I've worked at the city council in my lucky case, and they said, look, this is way too optimistic. One thing that they actually made me realize is, all these people that are buying into this particular development are not from here. They're all external international investors that don't know the area. So there's no one local that is buying these flats, and that's the reason. And for example, my friend's dad said, hey, we have lived here for a long time. We earn well. We had thought about buying an investment property in here, and we probably would have if we thought that it was a good investment. But there is a reason why we haven't done so yet, and we have lived here for 20 years. So that really made me reflect, it really resonated with me. And then finally, another thing is, there I noticed that the development that I was looking into and that I had reserved a flat in wasn't the only new development in that area. And people might think that that's a good thing, because it's, a sign of an up and coming area again, a sign of investment and regeneration and demand and all these things. And this is how developers will position it to you. But ultimately, supply and demand laws still apply. And if it's an area that is really not seeing that many people moving into it, the population trends are really not that positive, and really not growing at enough of a rate to justify all these like 200 new apartments that are being built and constructed, then of course the price is going to be driven down, because there's an oversupply and an under demand. So, and this is of course a very important consideration when you're thinking, especially when you buy as an investment, because in a few years time, when you go and sell, is there going to be 10 other flats that are very similar to yours, because they're all kind of built in a similar way, with a stamp almost. Is there going to be like 10 more flats that are up for sale, right, at the same time as yours? And so you're kind of like competing with each other, and so as a result you have to bring down the price to kind of beat them, basically. So it's a race to the bottom in a sense. And similarly, even if you're not selling, but what if you're like your plan, in my case, my plan was to rent it out on a short-term let basis, so on Airbnb, or for contract workers, so people that would go to the hospital maybe and work there as nurses or doctors in training or whatever else, for like a month or so. But again, how many of those are there, and are we all going to compete for the same few people, basically? So I to try and summarize, I basically understood and realized that I hadn't done enough of a due diligence on the actual understanding of the area, the population dynamics, the actual regeneration that is going into it, the investments that were being advertised, but like really going beyond the surface level of what the agency is putting on their, brochures, very polished and very nice brochures. And main piece of advice there is, in my case, I was lucky that I had people, from there living there. Of course, it's not always going to be true for every situation and every person, but still, there are so many agencies and so many associations that can still help you, even though you don't know them personally. You can still go to them, speak to them, and try and really understand the area, especially when you're investing from outside. And honestly, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to actually go there. And it might sound redundant, it might sound like you don't need to say it, but I'm a person that is very, thorough and diligent, etc. And even I wasn't really prioritizing doing that, and I was almost not going to go and close on a house that I hadn't seen myself, which is now bonkers. Like, if I think back on that, I'm like, what were you thinking, right? So, luckily I did, and that really helped me kind of like putting it all together. Ultimately, it was scary to walk away, and I knew that, of course, I was going to lose those 3K, which luckily for me is not too much. Like, it wasn't a huge loss. Of course, for there's 3K mean different things for different people, so I'm not here saying, oh, just like put down all this money and and if it works out, great. If not, whatever. Like, that's not what I'm saying. And actually, if I look back, I probably would have tried to negotiate even more the reservation fee. Originally, they asked me for £5,000, which is crazy. And I looked around and I saw that other developers were asking for 2.5K for literally for flats in that same unit that I was looking at. So, I went back to the developers. I was like, to the agency, sorry. I was like, why are you making me pay like, 2.5K more, basically double as much as, some other people are charging for the literal same flats. So, they brought it down to 2.5K. But honestly, I think I probably could have pushed even more for a lower reservation fee. So in the future, should I be in that situation, I would probably try and fight even more for a lower reservation fee. But at the end of the day, I'd rather lose 3.3K now than, have gone ahead with that investment just because I'd already, the sunken cost fallacy, again, that we talked about at the beginning, and then find myself stuck into an investment that is bad for me, basically. So this is it, I think, for me. So never rush on a property investment. Go there in person multiple times, ideally. Talk to people that lived in the area. And what I'm doing now, instead of putting that cash that I had already prepared, let's say, for that down payment, I am refocusing on ETFs, my pension, and also I have a few projects where I'll need some liquidity, so some cash basically for. So I've kept a portion of that money, still in a cash ISA, but that is earning me still like a 4.5 interest, a 4.5% interest at least, because otherwise you're literally losing money. And yeah, so I still believe in real estate overall. Again, I do have a property in Florence that I'm going to actually next week, which is exciting. So it's not like I'm swearing off property investment, and I do plan on investing in hopefully more properties should the right opportunity arise. But this particular one wasn't the right one for me, and I'm glad that I haven't rushed into it, and I took a step back, took the loss, and called it a day. And now I sleep knowing that I don't have an extra mortgage kind of on over my head, for an investment that I wasn't 100% convinced in. Because it would have been one thing being 100% convinced into an investment and taking on 100K debt, basically. But if you feel, half-hearted about an investment and you still have that six-figure mortgage as a result, then it makes it all different, even just psychologically, which is a huge part of money and investments, right? Don't ever underplay the importance of it. So with that being said, I hope this video was useful. I'm happy to share any of the trackers and the forecasting sheet that I prepared for you, for my investments with you, in case that would be useful. And other than that, I will see you next week. Bye.